Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. I'm joined today by two of my expert colleagues. I have with me Dr. Brian Marion, who is the other co-founder of the Positive Group. He's also a medic and a health psychologist. Good afternoon, Brian.
Good afternoon.
And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Catherine Marshall to today's webinar. Catherine recently joined the Positive team. She's heading up our delivery team and supporting our research and development team. So it's fantastic to welcome Catherine along and get her onto the first Positive webinar. Catherine's got a background as a medic, a doctor of medicine, but also specialized in psychiatry. She's also got a master's in medical ethics and law. So we're in incredibly good hands today, and I'm going to try and steer the discussion with you two over the next half an hour. Brian, Catherine, the subject that we have chosen for today's webinar is around recovery and mental energy. And I think this is a very relevant topic right now. I think it's something that everyone can relate to. It's been a very challenging period for, I'd say, almost everyone. And there's so many things that contribute to that, from all of the uncertainty that's happened, the anxiety, the working in new environments, the multitasking, etc. We'll go into all of those factors. But I think what we want to look at today is what are the psychological skills that we can develop as individuals, but also as leaders, that can help us to regain our energy, to recover more quickly, but also to think about the future. How do we create models of working where we can actually work with the grain of our brain, if you like? And as we look into the future, we're about to head into a new transition where people are heading back to the office, going to be starting to work in new ways. And I think this challenge around distraction, boundarying is something that we're having so many interesting conversations with clients around. Let's get started. Catherine, let me come to you first. It'd be great to just get your thoughts on the challenge that we're seeing, and just in the context of where we are right now, and why we're seeing this challenge around our energy.
Thanks, Will. I think undeniably the last 13, 14 months have really been filled with this need to constantly adapt. We've had to deal with quite extreme levels of uncertainty, everything from our own health to that of our loved ones, to our livelihoods. How we've worked through all of this has really placed us in some jeopardy at times. And the peaks and troughs of the energy have been quite interesting as well. Back in the early days of the pandemic, there was fear, but that actually sort of turned into this sense of potential. There was a surge of productivity, if you like. People were thinking of setting themselves goals around reading more or learning a language. But inevitably, that novelty wore off. The pandemic started to be replaced with this monotony of the lockdown we were in. And people were stressed, feeling lonely. Depression, anxiety was increased, and we didn't even have access to our usual support mechanisms, seeing our friends, or maybe, going to the gym. And then there was another sort of peak. Hope came in the form of a potential vaccination, and people were writing off 2020, 2021 is going to be great. We'll get back to our normal lifestyles. And then lo and behold, there's global impact of variants. And again, we find ourselves sort of going down back into a bit of a dip. It's not going to be a quick recovery. And all of this is on the backdrop of quite a lot of economic change, serious social issues as well. And it was really, frankly, really exhausting for people. And alongside all of this, having to develop the new ways of working that we have now, the blurring of the boundaries. Some people had to homeschool, for example. Working lives and home lives are really starting to overlap. And that actually was also happening before the pandemic. If you think about the always on culture and that knowledge economy, we were finding it difficult anyway to separate out these things. And a particular thing that I really notice with the ways of working now is the challenge we face to our communication skills by having online meetings. It's not enough just to be thinking about how good are we at conveying our points. We also have to think about how skilled are we at listening and picking up other people's emotional cues. And that is really tiring. And all of this is taking its toll on our psychological health. So whereas before, reassurance might have been, well, you know, my colleagues were engaged with work, and that was quite a good indicator for positive well-being and some protection against burnout. That's actually completely changed now, and really it's the opposite. People's increased engagement, attachment to that always-on culture is really putting them at risk of burnout. And I know, you know, burnout's one of those words that you hear talked about a lot, but it's really important to pull out the difference here. It's not just about some sense of fatigue. It's also the feeling of strain that people get when they're burned out. That leads to them feeling that they're not doing well at their job, that they're not accomplishing what they should. And so kind of as an unhelpful mechanism, they start to withdraw from the purpose of what they're doing. And it can even lead to cynical thoughts about their job. And that's what really makes that sort of experience of burnout so dangerous. So it's been so many challenges, but I think this real up and down nature has tired people out.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's that sort of, I think you hit the nail on the head there with the, it's like we've sort of been in a perpetual state of multitasking, isn't it? Where you live at home, you work at home, and there's very little transition, the blurred lines, the distractibility. It's such a perfect storm for using up our energy. And I think, you know, stress is essentially, you know, the really rapid use of energy, isn't it, in that threat state. And I think, you know, some of the, you know, we talked a lot about the research around this, but some of our data, which I think is really interesting around this, is showing that, you know, those who are 44 years and under are significantly more stressed than those over 45 years, which I think is quite interesting. You know, linking into probably the pressures in that management and people leader space. You know, we know that, you know, particularly young people are suffering from mental health challenges at the moment, but I think it's really interesting to see that pressure on in that sort of people leader space. And we've heard that from clients, and so yeah, just so much converging there. Brian, just to follow up on that, you know, what's the impact of this, just quickly, you know, personally, but also around sort of performance and relationships and how we interact?
Well, I think as Catherine's outlined, this has taken its toll, and the epidemiology of psychological health demonstrates that. So if you look at the Office for National Statistics data or University College London over here in the UK, there's been a massive uptick in psychological problems for all the reasons that Catherine outlined. And I think it's very understandable. I think it's very normal. I think that's what happens when people's lives are disrupted, sometimes called adjustment, and those adjustments can be very difficult. So I think it's very understandable and very human. And it's estimated that about 50% of us have felt that it's had a detrimental impact on our psychological health. But I think this links to psychological health and energy and attention and our capacity to function at work. And there's a very powerful correlation between your psychological health and your ability to focus your attention. And we know that people who have good psychological health tend to get the best from their brain. Their brain is online. They can access all areas. So their cognitive function improves, and it's not difficult to measure cognitive function. So this is a key performance indicator for organizations. And I think the other feature is that our attentional focus is a very, very limited capacity. It's got a tiny capacity, and it links into what we recall and what we memorize. And if you don't pay attention to something, then you can't memorize it, because it is the gateway to memory. So interestingly, what happens when we get stressed or worried or wound out or fatigued is our attentional focus drops and our ability to process data drops, and that can impact on performance. But just to finish on this, there's a nasty kicker really, that is, a lot of us, when we get stressed, it affects our cognitive function, our physical health, and how we relate to one another. And then what often happens is it's aversive, it's unpleasant, and we can get stressed about being stressed, and that just feeds the monster.
Absolutely, and I mean some of the things that some of the impact of this that we're hearing from clients is also the impact on things like decision making, being able to direct people. We've seen an increase in elements of micromanagement. So all of those factors coming in as those levels of fatigue and distractibility increase amongst particularly amongst leaders. But we'll come on to that shortly. Brian, we're going to get into how mental energy works in a second, which is and really looking at those psychological skills. Just very quickly before we do, I just want to share with our audience some exciting news from Positive. We've been working for probably the last 12 months with our brilliant partners Radio Wolfgang on the second series of The Resilient Road, which is a podcast series where we take and we record incredible stories of human resilience and endeavor, and we look at analyzing those and looking at what the psychological skills, the cognitive and behavioral models and techniques that they apply to overcome incredible challenges. Brian, you've been in the recording studio with Radio Wolfgang and Sinead and Elle and the team here. Just give the audience a teaser of what's coming up. What were your favourite stories?
Well, they are genuinely remarkable. There are 5, and the first one is Catherine Gunn, who is an extraordinary woman. I have to say I was bowled over by her story, and she demonstrates huge resilience and strength by speaking truth to power. She's a whistleblower, but she had to remain incredibly steadfast, doing what she believed to be the right thing and holding on to her truth, which she did in the face of extraordinary pressure. And she demonstrated huge tenacity and with such humility as well. It's a fantastic story, and I have to say it's well worth a listen. The others are equally extraordinary, but in different ways. They're sort of different stories of incredible resilience. But I think, as you mentioned, what they do is they identify some human factors that can help us survive difficulties. One is a guy called Brett Archibald, who falls overboard on a boat and spends 108 hours in the Indian Ocean, and it's an extraordinary story. Another is Rob Billett. There's a film being made about him, Dark Water, and his extraordinary battle against a huge corporate that took him years, and it's a fantastic story. A story of a community which I think is fascinating, who survived, or many of them survived, a devastating fire that destroyed their community. And then somebody who experiences the cancel culture and how you cope with that, and how she bounces back from what was a grueling attack. So yeah, they're really interesting on a very human level, and understanding some of the things that they managed to do that helped them get through it.
Brilliant. Well, look, that's going to be out, and the Catherine Gunn episode gets released in 2 weeks' time. So if you want to learn more about that or download and hear that, do sign up to our newsletter. We'll put a link in the chat now. We'll also put a link into the first series, and there's some brilliant stories in that. But let's get back to today's topic, and energy. Brian, I'd just love to dig into how our mental energy works, because I think this is the cornerstone for understanding what we can do to manage our energy as we move forward.
Well, I think it's a limited resource. We've only got a certain quantum of cognitive energy. And interestingly, it depends what you're using your mind for. When we're doing things that interest us and stimulate us, that engage us, when we get into flow, all sorts of things happen in terms of our neurochemistry and our physiology, and we feel alive and we feel motivated. The sad thing is we don't spend our entire time in flow, and particularly if you're stressed and wound out. And I think this comes back to this concept of, what are you using your mind for? And we know from lots of studies now that when we get stressed and worried or anxious, as we've been talking about with COVID, is that it hijacks our attention and it uses up a shed load of energy. And we've only got that quantum of energy. So the problem is it uses up that energy, which then depletes our capacity to focus our attention and process information. And the other big problem is we can start to ruminate, we can start to worry. And that worry and rumination, and there's a lot of research on this now, but it shows that people who are ruminating have cognitive impairment. So they find it difficult to stay on task. They to find it difficult to initiate a task or even order their tasks. So what's happening is that when our energy is depleted, either through fatigue or through stress, both of which are fatiguing, it actually undermines our ability to use that quantum of energy effectively and efficiently.
So it's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Sort of as your stress levels or anxiety go up, your distractibility goes up, the thoughts, the images, occur, and that switching concept. It'd be good to dig into that, because that's incredibly hungry on the energy process, isn't it?
It is, and I think one of the problems is that when we get anxious and worried and stressed, we have more spooky thoughts. We find it more difficult to concentrate. So we switch around more readily. We find it difficult to keep our attention on what we want to focus on. And it's the great Stephen Covey line: good attentional focus is keeping the main thing the main thing. Whereas when we're stressed, little thoughts or things come into our mind and take us away, or we're easily distracted. So our ability, our cognitive capacity to focus our attention in an efficient way is diminished. And you see this impacting on cognitive performance, on concentration, memory, but also on executive skills, decision-making. And it's been called a form of attention deficit. It's an attention deficit disorder that is being created temporarily by feeling stressed and wound out.
But then, I mean, we look at the key skill within our sort of focus pillar is looking at sort of attentional control. So there are things we can do to actually improve our attentional control enormously, aren't there? And I think just one of the things that really contextually links this into that we hear a lot from all sorts of people at the moment is the sort of boundarying, isn't it? So you hear that you're at work, but you feel like you should be with your family, or you're distracted thinking about something else. And when you're with your friends or your family, you're thinking about work. So you're not doing either particularly effectively. And I think as those fatigue levels come up, you're starting to see that real challenge around that. And that in and of itself is draining. It increases our stress levels. So it'd just be good to touch on that very quickly, and also this concept around attentional control.
I think that's really key. And what's been shown is that being able to focus your attention is a neuroplastic process. So you can get better at it. It's like an attentional muscle. The more you use it, the better you get. Now, most psychological problems have problems with worry and rumination, and they take our mind off piece. They take us into other areas. There's a lot of research now on what's called attentional training, which is a fantastic cognitive tool, which builds attentional control. And the more you do this, the better you get at it. It really is a neuroplastic process. And it's also incredibly effective at treating psychological problems. So I think this is something that can be embedded into teams and organizations quite quickly once they understand the mechanisms.
But it's easy to understand. It's quite hard to do, as with everything we talk about. Catherine, just coming to this concept of sort of creating greater agency around what we're paying attention to and how that links through to our energy is obviously key to this attentional control skill that we're touching on. But there's also lots of things we can consider. It's not just internal interruptions, is it? There are sort of other factors that we can consider around this, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly. As Brian said, we need to identify the internal factors at play to build up our psychological skills around attentional control, managing our focus state and our recharge state. But fortunately, there are also external factors that we can address. So those things that are affecting our mental energy, we can also try and make adjustments there. And interestingly, they can be affecting us at an individual level, but also at an organizational level. So if you're addressing the external factors, there's a capacity to have a sort of broad change if you can get it embedded. I think reducing distractions is perhaps one of the more obvious things that comes to mind here. But anyone who has tried doing this will know it can be quite hard. And really the key difference to making it work comes down to the personal commitment you can make to the change. So we know our brains are drawn to novelty, and even that unconscious expectation of a phone notification or intermittent psychological rewards we get scrolling through social media, it's hard to minimize those. So I think here what's helpful is the idea of goal setting around planning how to avoid a distraction. That's much more powerful. And also it's something you can take into an organization, because you can use that to set up a way of dealing with these things, or a policy change, if you like, to really embed the changes into the culture. And the second thing is really recognizing recharge time as being used wisely, because we all know we should take breaks. But when we have a lot on our plate, sometimes we just think, I'll power through, or, I just want to get this done. There was an interesting study by Bayer and Schnall that looked at how time spent working without a break affected requests for loan restructuring. And the results noted that there were more rejections of requests for loan restructuring towards the end of a period of working. So, as lunch approached. And so basically the worker's judgment was getting affected. Their brain had used up all its energy, and their executive function was starting to fall off first. So the ultimate consequence was that those loans weren't getting repaid, and there was a bigger financial impact for the company. So it really goes to show how important it is to structure in those breaks. And I think in the current world, reflecting back on our big team, as sort of like idea of what's going on right now, we've lost a lot of those natural recharging moments. Yes. So whereas we used to have transitions, it might be a commute, it might even just be moving to another part of the office or another room for a meeting. We've lost that now. So we have to be so proactive about putting in breaks and choosing to do something which is going to be stimulating enough that it's not too cognitively taxing, but at the same time, not too boring. We need to get into a recharge state, feed our energy at different levels. Maybe it's physical energy with exercise, or emotional energy by making a connection with someone else. And of course, we know connecting, improving those relationships is such a big energy booster.
Absolutely. And I we're not going to touch too much on connection, but I think just the energy we get from human connection has obviously been lost. It's not the same in this medium, and even if it's in those transitions, the commuting process, that you get a greater perspective than just sort of leaving your loft room, don't you? So there's so much in terms of, fortunately, as well, touch wood, is going to come back into our lives, but the energy generation from others is absolutely huge, and there's so much evidence to show that. Although we're not going to touch too much on that today, I'd love to move on to just some of the sort of cultural display rules around this, because I think what we're talking about here is really changing how we work, and there's a huge opportunity in this time, particularly as we transition into a new way of working, and most people and most organizations are devising plans around this or implementing plans around this. There's a huge opportunity to consider the behaviors that that people want to support, that are going to put the human more at the center of this, that are going to consider this enormous change that's happened in our world of working. So much of this is going to fall into that sort of leadership space. And I know we talk a lot about this, but we've seen this in terms of the psychological health, where all of our data over the last 6 months has shown that if leaders role model good psychological health behaviors, you see an increase of, on average, of 25% in the psychological health scores in their teams, and that's an astounding increase. So the shadow of the leader or the light of the leader is something that is so relevant right now. And I think if people want to make, and organizations want to make big changes around how we interact, how we operate, how we control our attention, how we control our energy, which links into so many of these sort of key future skills, looking at the leadership aspect is going to be key. Brian, what are your thoughts around how leaders impact this space?
Well, I think it's huge, and I think our research with some large organizations has highlighted the potency of this across the organization. And I think it is, as you said, that tone from the top, the shadow of the leader. I think often leaders are unaware sometimes of the power that they have in this regard. And it's this old concept that you cannot not communicate. You're always communicating. Even when you're not communicating, you are communicating, because the people in the organization look to the leadership, and the leadership create the culture. They create the rules. They create the norms. What's valued around here? What's rewarded around here? How do you get promoted around here? What do we actually think is good or not so good? And these cultural display rules are incredibly potent, and they influence what we do, because we're, as human beings, we have this concept of social conformity. We tend to do what other people are doing, and we do what is going to help us get on in a business. So there's fascinating research about what are called social networks. And again, I think the tone from the top is really relevant here. But if you have people who are kind and supportive and empowering to other people, and encouraging in the environment, that cascades through the group. It's contagious, but it's actually interestingly contagious to 3 degrees of separation. So if you're kind to somebody, they're going to be kind to the person they meet, who's going to be kind to the person they meet. And I think this is why the tone from the top is such an issue. And I think historically, organizations have praised and wanted and promoted on technical skills. And those technical skills are incredibly important, and strategy is incredibly important. And what are we doing and where are we going, and planning. But I think the people skills have been underestimated. And there's a sort of halo effect that occurs in organizations where you promote people because of their technical skills, but you assume because they have good technical skills, they'll have good people skills. They often don't. And just to finish on this, I think tolerance of uncertainty is a fascinating area. So there's a big meta-analysis looking at tolerance of uncertainty in leadership. And this is a fantastic example of contagion and cascade. What this meta-analysis showed was that leaders who have high tolerance of uncertainty, their organizations do better financially, they perform better. And I think this is because of the stories we tell. This is the old Henry Ford line, if you think you can or you think you can't, or if we think we can, then actually that message gives people a sense of hope, a sense of unity, a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, and people come behind you and follow you through. So I think this is a fascinating, and I think it links to trust. I think the danger is when the leadership espouse values, purpose, but they don't walk the talk. That is devastating. That's hypocrisy. It undermines trust, and it has a devastating impact on morale. And I think if you get morale right and trust right, people can cope with all sorts of adversity. So it's a really protective mechanism that links to social support.
Absolutely, and I think I mean, if there's any of the audience listening who want to know, more around how we work with leaders and teams in this space, we've developed an approach which we're calling Navigating the New World, which is really looking at a lot of the skills we've talked about today, particularly attentional control, but also looking at the mindset around the future, looking at elements around sort of realistic optimism, and then possibly most importantly is this element around connection, which links into what Brian's been talking to around developing empathy, developing trust, building those skills in leaders, and linking that into the storytelling and the communication into teams and the power of that. So if anyone wants to know more about that, we'll stick a link in the chat shortly, and we'd love to we can then share more details around that, and we'd love to speak to anyone out there that wants to. I'm just aware we're on the nose of time. It's such a big topic, we could talk about this for hours. It's always hard to keep it to half an hour. I'm just going to come to you, Catherine, to sort of wrap this up, and it'd be lovely to think about sort of just key takeaways and a few things that people can sort of think about, possibly even more practically around what we've discussed today.
Yeah, sure. Let's try and sort of whip this up into a quick summary for you. 3 things that I think could be useful takeaways. The first 2 sort of more for yourself, and then the third one about supporting other people. So first of all, you've really just got to embrace your situation and show yourself some empathy. You know, one of my mantras, to be your best professional self, you really have to be looking after yourself, and it's as simple as that. Secondly, and this is more of a practical advice, go through your diary and identify where there's a possible depleter, something that's going to sap your energy. Maybe it's a tricky meeting, or there's a sort of mundane task you need to do and there's going to be a bit of a deadline. Then be proactive and insert some kind of energizer that you can do immediately after. Select your energizer, something you'll actually do. So don't put in a run if there isn't time for a run. It might be listen to a song, or I don't know, read something funny. But it's that circuit breaker that gives you the opportunity for a small recharge, and then you can get back into your focus state. It also sort of boosts your sense of autonomy because you have put that intervention in play. And then my final thing is, when it comes to supporting others, please remember that showing appreciation really fosters their resilience. So instead of just saying to someone, well done, you worked really hard there, say thank you and well done, because you've helped me. This is the effect it's had, and hopefully that will improve their sense of well-being and resilience.
Brilliant, fantastic, Catherine. I think that's a great summary, and I've really enjoyed today's discussion. I think there's so much here that's relevant to the challenges for individuals, for leaders, for teams. I think it's you know, nobody's got all the answers to this. I think the point is about sort of experimenting, isn't it, and actually trying things. And there is this window of opportunity right now to think about how the new way of working can work for you as an individual, a team, leader, organization. So do get in touch if you want to know more from us. But that's all for today. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, Brian. Have a good day all. Bye-bye.